Finally, we come to the creation of a so special socio-linguistic community, Israel, through which God has spoken to mankind. His unique work through this nation ought to sharpen our understanding of appropriate hermeneutics for interpreting judgment and blessing texts. All such texts expound Yahweh's relationship to Israel, and that relationship is controlled by covenants. Covenant is another word for contract. People enter into contracts with each other to stabilize relationships and to build trust. Every culture has its own manner of entering into contractual relationships. They do this in downtown Baghdad now. But their contracts always have the same essentials: definition of the parties to the contract, codification of expected behavior, and some sort of enforcement criteria, and an enduring record of that contract. Two hermeneutical implications follow. The meaning of the contract's terminology must be conserved for the duration of the contract, from origin to fulfillment. And two, only literal meanings can be verified or falsified for the environmental criteria. So we summarize this section before we head to our conclusion. I've argued that we must break free from naive faith in modern cosmology and anthropocentric epistemology. And in this section, we hopefully have unearthed enough credible information regarding language origin and capabilities to avoid unintentional contamination from modern language theories on the hermeneutics of cosmic catastrophe texts. Now, in the conclusion, we're going to list some contributions I think can come to this interpreting problem, the interpretation of the hermeneutical issues. An important dialogue occurred in the Dispensational Study Group, Evangelical Theological Society, in 2007 between Brant Sandy, proponent of this, and Mike Stollard, who's here, who is an advocate of traditional dispensationalism. While Stollard agrees with Sandy we must be careful to discover and respect metaphors, he rightly cautions against the lowered capability of figurative language interpretation to discern meaning. Knowing the big idea of a passage, its purpose, and perhaps its genre is important, but one can't obtain these truths without first working upward from the textual details. It's the details that give meaning to the overall and keep it from becoming a vague generalization. Stollard's warning applies in particular to the hermeneutics of uncertainty regarding cosmic catastrophe. Prophecies of terrestrial and extraterrestrial phenomena, both judgment and redemptive, were given within a special socio-linguistic community created for the very purpose of special revelation. Due to God's sovereign conditioning of Israel, we can infer some hermeneutical helps for our subject material. Number one, texts like Matthew 24, Revelation 6, that so reflect Old Testament prophetic passages have to be interpreted in a community context that included pre-Abrahamic texts containing the only true depiction of cosmogony and cosmology. We ought not therefore to think that external pagan cosmology sources, ancient or modern, are necessary to understand the meaning of the Bible. They may be helpful, but necessary, no. Peter viewed the end time with a cosmic language derived from these pre-Abrahamic source materials that saw the flood not only as global, but as an event that changed the entire cosmos. Look at the text of 2 Peter 3. He's talking about the heavens, not just the earth. The prophets spoke from within that perspective, so that either their view of the world is literally true, or it's just an intriguing autobiography of their imagination. 2, texts like Habakkuk 3 obviously remember the Exodus event with cosmic imagery. The imagery of geophysical and astronomical instruments of judgment against Egypt, as well as Canaan, should be taken literally. There's no prima facie reason to interpret descriptions of the Exodus plagues, especially the day of darkness, figuratively. Undoubtedly, figurative language accompanies this kind of text. Yahweh's actions are metaphorically linked to human weaponry. Egypt at the time of the Exodus depicted as an evil monster. But the figurative language is used to link the socio-political situation to the parallel history of the unseen universe, just as the king of Tyre is linked to Satan in Ezekiel 28. There is a hermeneutical precedent here. Literal interpretation of the phenomenon itself, figurative interpretation of the unseen spiritual agents involved. 3, interpretation of judgment and blessing texts for Israel must consider them as exercise of enforcement criteria within the Mosaic covenant contract. Israel's subsequent history under this special contractual relationship with God also established and then reinforced the community's understanding of judgment and blessings. The prophets, centuries later, would appeal to the contract's original witnesses. See, for example, Isaiah and Micah. Just as the prophets linked Israel's infractions to contract stipulations, so the resulting judgments were seen as consequences of contract violations. Sandy is correct In noting there is variation between prophetically threatened judgments and available evidence of fulfillment, but the judgments were nonetheless literal, how else can a contractual relationship be validated? And how do we know for sure that the threatened judgments have fully come to pass? One must be cautious in accepting the hermeneutical implications of saying with Sandy and others that the language of curses and blessings, quote, originated, end quote, in ancient Near Eastern culture. Pagan analogies to biblical covenants were legalistic creations of political convenience, and they were not enforceable through nature. Their expressions of judgment, therefore, were laced with hyperbole. 4, and there's 3 subpoints to this. 4a, hermeneutics of end-time judgments and recreation of the so-called apocalyptic texts need to be reviewed in at least 3 regards. First, I question the knee-jerk reaction to interpret figuratively every numerical pattern seen in this sort of literature. Terry, for instance, sees the 7-day pattern in Genesis 1 as an artificial symmetry of structure. Then he compares it to the 7-fold structures in Revelation, observing that the 7 days of cosmology are no more to be interpreted literally than are the 7 trumpets of the apocalypse. Both of these chapters are the nature of an apocalypse. But can't the natural creation of God have symmetry without an artificially imposed one? One doesn't have to be a Platonist to see real symmetry and numerical patterns all through God's handiwork, from crystals, think of snowflakes, to the widely occurring Fibonacci ratios in plants, seashells, and we have a demo out on one of Fred Wilson out on one of the tables here of the Fibonacci in seeds, to the optimized 4-letter genetic code arranged in 3-letter words throughout all amino acids. Isn't the Trinity a numerical sequence? Structure, I mean? One needs more evidence than a mere numerical pattern to conclude there is a referent-less figurative language involved. A second reconsideration of end-time judgments and recreation interpretation concerns the universality and scope. End-time judgments include all nations and their environments, both the phenomenal world and the background of spiritual powers. These judgments appear to be distinguishable from judgments against Israel in the Mosaic covenant contract. I wonder if the preterists have thought this through. Think about this. When the language of cosmic catastrophe is used, it generally recalls the Exodus judgment. Was the Exodus judgment against Israel? The Exodus judgment was against the Gentile nations. So it's striking that these kind of judgments aren't the disciplinary ones, but the Exodus is a type of the second coming judgment upon the earth. And so when cosmic language is included in judgments affecting Israel, such as Joel 2, it seems to be the end-time judgment rather than an imminent one under the Mosaic covenant contract. When cosmic language appears in a text, it should be studied with the realization that the Exodus and conquest strongly conditioned the Hebrew language of final judgment. Literal interpretation should be used unless it can be shown that there is a reference to the unseen powers behind history in this world. And finally, the third part C. Interpretation of end-time language of recreation, this is the total recreation of the new universe, should proceed with the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ in mind. Unlike the utopian pagan eschatology of various versions of Marxism, biblical eschatology looks for an entire new universe that we already know has begun. The resurrection body of Jesus has the same form as his mortal body with flesh and bones, yet it is able to transition between this world and the unseen world. It can eat, it can drink, as our bodies do. Yet it is fixed forever and cannot die. George Ladd put it this way. If we may use crude terms that describe sublime realities, we may say that the piece of the eschatological resurrection has been split off and planted in the midst of history. The resurrection of Jesus shows that there will be a literal recreation in an instant of time of a world remarkably like our own, yet permanently locked in a sinless state. It can be described in language based on our experience in this world. There is no need, therefore, for infecting our hermeneutic of end-time prophecy with pagan cosmology, Kantian epistemology, and anthropocentric language theories. We rush to get through, and I hope we have 10 minutes or so for Q&A.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. That was outstanding. Do you see I see the connection, and I was hoping perhaps you could elaborate a little bit between, are you familiar with, I believe he's German, his name is Witt, his book, In the Beginning Was Information.
Yeah.
Okay, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the connection between
The gentleman has raised the question about the German evangelical, Dr. Witt. He's written a book called In the Beginning Was Information, and it's one of the clearest expositions I know by a Christian of information theory. And it's interesting to point out because these linguist guys, a lot of them are not familiar with information theory that largely developed in electronics and theory of communication. And the connection is that that language conveys information from one mind to another. And when you see a message, for example, expressed in DNA, that is a description, it's a design description of something that's going to happen in the future that doesn't yet exist. There's a message in there. And the point, Git goes into this, he gives you tremendous bibliography and shows you that that's one of the arguments for ID, for intelligent design, that language doesn't spontaneously erupt like the 20th century pure poets. It can't be generated that way. But that book, In the Beginning Was Information, I think is critical if you are struggling in this area to get hold of, because when we deal as Bible-believing Christians, we are dealing with information flow from God's mind to ours. And that involves language. And you mess around with an alien philosophy of language and you just start severing the throughput. You know? It's like the baud rate goes down because you're not exploiting the throughput that God designed into the human language.
Charlie,
Yes.
Charlie, thank you so much. Are you familiar with Peter Enns' book, Inspiration and Incarnation?
No.
Okay. It goes along somewhat the same way. We're critiquing it here at our college. We're just into it. I've already read the entire book, but